Namaskar. Welcome to the 13th edition of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival in association with Nexa at Charbagh. We are delighted to introduce session number 51, Winners Take All, the elite charade of the changing world, presented by Business Standard. We request you to kindly turn your phones on silent mode. Please join me in welcoming writer and Time editor at large, Anand Giridharadas, who's the recipient of many honors, such as the Society of Publishers in Asia, the Poynter Fellowship of Aspen Institute, for his remarkable contributions to the literary world, who's going to be in conversation with the illustrious Asne Seirstad, journalist and author of 6 books. Let's welcome the both of them with a huge round of applause.
Hello, welcome. I'm very excited to be here. I think you must be too. This is the first time Anand is back in India after writing this wonderful book. We will talk for an hour. I will open for questions. But first I have to admit that I wake up with Anand every morning. And it's like, it has to do, I think, with the time difference, that when I wake up, no, I don't know about you, but do you take up your phone? Is that the first thing you do, like check the watch? And then I have him as a favorite, and he always comes up first, every day, wakes me up. And very often what happens is I'm again engaged reading about, all the things that he'd found out throughout the day. And very often I'm too late to wake up my children because this is such an engaging theme. And I have to say that your whole book has been a wake-up call for me, that many of the things that you describe in this book are things that I've felt. I've kind of had, some kind of intuition that this is happening, but I haven't had the words for it when it comes to changing the world. The way the news speak, how the global elite are keeping the world or pretending to change the world to keep it in their benefits. So I would like to start by asking, how did this, you could have been one of them. You were an insider, an aspiring insider into a very elite business world. What made you leave that crowd?
Well, thank you all for being here. As Asna was saying, I haven't been here in some years, and it's really exciting to be back. Given that this is a book about the depravity of billionaires and the crisis of democracy, I hope you may find it relevant. For me, and I want to say at the outset, this is a book mostly about what's happening in the United States, where I live. And I think there are many things about it that are true of many other places, and I leave you to figure that out for yourselves wherever you come from. But for me, this originated in making a kind of double-barreled observation about the United States and to some extent the world, which is that we live in this time, and this is true in India also, we live in this time of tremendous, extraordinary innovation and of stories about all the amazing new possibilities of the new world. And we live in a time of extraordinary prosperity. And we live in a time in which these very, very wealthy people who have won the most from the new world we live in, who have helped invent that new world, who have profited handsomely from that new world, are constantly telling us that they are changing the world. They are building the nation. They are giving back. They are making a difference. And you see this in different forms. You see this through business leaders, whether it's Mukesh Ambani in India or Mark Zuckerberg in the United States, who say, they're kind of building the nation through their intrinsic business activities. You see it, whether it's Azim Premji or Jeff Bezos, people talking about their philanthropy. They're going to make lots of money, but then they're going to give back and change the world. And you see it in the new forms of social enterprise, where a lot of young people drawn to this idea of creating a business, cupcake company that's going to give back, or socks. If you buy these socks, Africa will forever be saved by the socks. Tote bags, anything basically involving Bono. And you look at all these activities, impact, investing, the list goes on, and you know all of these in India as well as the United States. And all these people giving back, and all these people creating these businesses. And that set of reality sits uncomfortably next to another stubborn sense of reality, which is that this also happens to be, in my country, and maybe you agree in yours, a moment of profound crisis for democracy in which the very same class of wealthy people and beneficiaries of this age, in many cases, the actual same people, have become monopolists on progress itself, have become hoarders of the future, of the fruits of the future. That the very same people who talk such a great game about giving back, about creating community, about changing the world, about making a difference, about this hospital they do, about that homeless program they do, these same people don't pay people enough, don't pay their damn taxes, lobby for public policies that benefit them privately at the expense of virtually everybody else. And so I became curious about the relationship between fact number one, rich people making a difference, or talking about making a difference, and fact number two, which is rich people making a killing in a way that is strangulating democracy. And I think the conventional wisdom about fact number one and fact number two, which is that, at least these rich people are trying something. At least these billionaires are doing something. There's a kind of at least argument. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, the world they're building is tough on anybody who makes the mistake of being a regular person, but at least they're trying. And I became curious about, in some ways, the at least argument is like, if only we had more Mark Zuckerbergs, and those Mark Zuckerbergs had more money, and they were giving more of it away, then maybe we could solve these problems we have. And I became curious about a different possibility, which is maybe we have these problems because these billionaires do just enough good, these companies do just enough good. ExxonMobil has a remarkable renewables program. They do just enough good to preserve fundamentally a system that does harm on a much bigger scale. And so I reported it out. I have a lot of opinions, but I'm a reporter, so I try to have opinions at the end of the reporting. And I spent a few years talking to people, interviewing people, going behind the scenes, trying to understand how these billionaires and foundation leaders and CEOs think. And what I found was that the very wealthiest people on earth have tended to promote a particular idea of how you get a good society, which is that you leave wealthy people alone to make as much money as they can make in whatever which way they need to make it, cutting every social corner they can possibly cut, not paying those taxes, not paying those workers, lobbying for that bottle service, private public policy that's only good for them. And then, in a very flamboyant way with a lot of publicists, giving back a little. And that this model has defrauded democracy. And this model of making a difference is the wingman of making a killing for those people. This model of giving back is the wingman of taking too much for those people. This model of changing the world is the wingman of keeping things the same for those people. And that this model fundamentally of them doing good is the wingman of them continuing to have the right to do harm to our societies, our economies, our politics, and our planet. And so I'm happy to be here talking to you about this, and very happy to be in conversation with Asne.
One of the core elements of this new way of trying to run the world is bypassing government, which is undemocratic in the sense that you have, in your book, you have CEOs who are talking about people as, not their people, but these people who are actual people with actual opinions and actually do vote, or a queen who is also annoyed by the fact that politicians have to think of elections and voters. I'm just wondering, to what extent is this destroying our democracy? Do people, I mean, they would say that, where are people's voice here? What can people do in this new system?
You know, the issue you raise is very important, because a lot of what I write about are things that are ideas that are all around us, that seem seductive and seem good, and I'm trying to make you realize that they're not as good as they seem. And one of these ideas is this very classy sounding denigration of government that does not sound like the denigration of government. So it sounds like this, and you tell me if you've heard this. You know, this climate crisis is terrible, but governments aren't acting, so the private sector has to take the lead. Have you heard that argument? Or you hear, you know, yes, it would be much better if India had better infrastructure, or the United States had better infrastructure, but the government's not doing it, so, you know, public-private partnerships in which billionaires decide which ones they fund and which ones they don't. We're going to do that instead. There's this sort of course we love government, but it's not showing up, so let us do it. And let's solve the world through ice cream companies that donate a little bit to the poor or whatever. And I want to make the case to you that this is the old trickle-down economics, the old anti-government ideology that we all know from our societies, with whipped cream and a cherry on top. It's the same thing dressed up. And what happened was, starting in the late 70s, 1980s, you had this ascendancy of the neoliberal idea, which is that everything can be solved by putting things in the hands of business people. Everything can be solved by unshackling commerce. And that idea was a frontal war on the idea of government. Now, there's some places where maybe there was too much government, right? Maybe you might feel that about India, relative to other places where that same conversation happened. But that revolution has gone so far, it has invalidated the very idea of government. And what started to happen was you started to have all these social problems multiplying, and government being less funded, less capable of solving them. That starts to make people angry. So what did these folks do? They realized that, and they started coming forward with a second argument. Instead of saying government's the enemy, government's always bad, we have to get rid of government, they start with this second thing of, yes, in an ideal world, government would be here, but it's not, so we're going to step in. And what this complete story misses is that the very people regretting, lamenting the absence of government are the reason government doesn't have resources and doesn't have capacity. So first, they fight to defund government, defang government, make government incapable by pulling resources, pulling authority. And then they publicly lament the situation they cause, which is like when I lament eating the French fries that I ordered. It's hard to lament something that you ordered and ate, but that's what they do. And so this anti-government ideology in our time, we have to recognize it because it takes place in this very different form. It doesn't show up in the Reagan-Thatcher government is terrible form. It takes the place, it takes this kind of new avatar of, you know, we just have to do the best we can. At least we're doing something. At least the bank that helped make 10 million people homeless in the financial crisis is helping 46 people now. And we are fools if we think 46 and 10 million are the same number of people.
The rise of inequality. If you look in your book, you write about, you know, the amount of billionaires you need to, you know, to be equal to 1/2 of the world is decreasing. Now I think it's 8 billionaires on the rest half of the world. You have Bill Gates, who, after saying some years ago that he would give away all his money, his fortune has doubled. there's something in the system that just, it's, it goes in their favor in the US and other countries. And you write about in your book that instead of, wishing for hopeful solutions, as they want us to do, like with inspirational thought leaders and that kind of people, we need a systemic change. And that systemic change, do you see, is it possible? Is there somehow, you also write about the anger on the streets, is that systemic change possible to achieve?
I mean, I think first of all, you have to start with the question, which is a question that was not acceptable to ask until very recently. You tell me what the conversation is here. I will tell you, in the United States, this was not an acceptable question until recently, which is, should we even have billionaires? Is this a thing we should have? We forget that it's a choice. Your tax policy that you have determines the shape of the income distribution. And in the United States, which celebrates wealth so much, this was an unacceptable question, but it's become an acceptable question. And there's a guy who works for Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the great stars of this conversation. Dan Riffle's her staffer, and his Twitter name is "Every Billionaire is a Policy Failure." Which is not saying every billionaire is a bad person. I'm saying every billionaire is a policy failure. Every time we let a billionaire slip up through the cracks, upward through the cracks, it is a measure of our policies to have failed, because it's a question of priority. In this country, what choices are we making to decide we should first allow some people to have billions and billions of dollars in fortunes before we decide everybody has had food tonight? What choice is that? We forget that this is our choice. We forget that if you had a wealth tax, if you had certain labor protections, if you had a certain wage, you'd have a different distribution. And so I have been trying to just open the Overton window of that conversation of saying, we should think about whether we want billionaires. Maybe the thing to do with billionaires is to just not have them, right? And they would still be okay. They would still be here, right? They would still eat in better restaurants than you. They would just maybe have less money. And once we begin to have that conversation, then you actually start asking. And I'll give you the example of the United States. I'm sure this is true here with different numbers. You look at the Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders wealth tax proposals. What's remarkable about these numbers is both of them have chosen to confine their wealth taxes to a very small number of people. 100,000 families, something in that order of magnitude, in a country of 300 million people. They very deliberately, politically kept it to a small number of people where you're pretty sure that's not you. And then you look at what we could fund in the United States, which is a very high-cost country compared to this country, what we could fund in the United States for everybody through a tax that would literally only affect 100,000 families. It would basically affect nobody except very few people. We could eliminate everybody's student debt, fund universal child care for all children, free college at all public colleges and universities, and other stuff. Now, whether you not think this tax and these policies are, just think about what that is. Think about how much money is under 100,000 people's mattresses. That you could fund all of that stuff for 300 million people by taking somewhere between 2 and 10% a year of the richest fortunes on earth, when those fortunes last year, the 500 richest people on earth last year, their wealth grew at 25% per annum. $1.2 trillion. So under the most aggressive wealth tax proposal in the United States, which I think is at either 8 or 10%, Bernie Sanders, the wealthiest people in America would have had their wealth increase at 15% last year instead of 25. And they call this demonization of the rich, vilification, a war. If that is a war, draft me.
You're drafted. You were sitting in this chair in Austin, South by Southwest, and you were interviewing Elizabeth Warren. I was there in the audience. And I remember her answer to the same question you asked her about, do we need billionaires? And she answered, when everyone has health care, when everyone has free education, when everyone is covered, it's okay with having billionaires then. And then you followed up, okay, so a Norwegian billionaire is okay.
She's fine with Norwegian billionaires.
That's yeah. And I just have to say a little, this what you're talking about is happening in the crib of social democracy and socialism, which is Scandinavia. Like we just that same thing that we need money, business money, and now like I grew up in a society where you are citizens and not consumers. But now we are building a new national gallery. And they need the government, we have a right-wing government, they need private money. And there's this billionaire in Norway. He's made his fortune on, shady business in oil, in fisheries, and so on. And he doesn't live in Norway because he doesn't want to pay taxes. So he lives.
Sounds like a great guy.
He lives in Cyprus. So he doesn't pay anything in taxes. But he'd like to, through his daughter, donate some money to the National Gallery if his name, Fredrickson, is put on the hall where he doesn't even donate the art. He rents it out or loans it out. And of course, it will all increase after it's been in the National Gallery. And on every single picture is supposed to stand in the memory of his wife who died of cancer. And that hall. And for me personally, it hurts me. Like, the fact that we, growing up in this society, being citizens, and suddenly every time I go to the National Gallery, I'm reminding of that tax invader. He doesn't, he's fleeing tax. So I'm just wondering about this, how we relate to each other. We've been talking earlier about the corrosion of society. Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, just individual men and women. Where does this lead us? The fact that citizens as having a right to healthcare or having a right to not being reminded of some rich person who don't pay taxes when you go to a national gallery. We're becoming like United States, even in Europe. So can you say something about that fabric of society, that corrosion, like people be having rights, not having to be thankful for charity, whether it's art or education or Taco Bell Foundation?
I think we sometimes, those of us who are lucky enough to live in democracies, whether healthy ones or ones that are, coughing very badly, is that we forget what democracy really means in a deeper sense. It's not just a procedure. It's not just a thing we do every 4 or 5 years and get a stain on our fingernail and then it's, people governing us that we grumble about. It's actually a way of life that has to do with the idea, the radical idea in history, the idea that's been true only believed for a very small fraction of our history as human beings, which is that we can take care of each other. And that actually we can take care of each other through choices, through rational choices, through shared decision making, better than the smartest person in the land can take care of us without our permission. Better than the nicest person in the land can take care of us without our permission. This is a very radical and beautiful idea. And, this country has bet very deeply on that idea in a region where a lot of other countries did not bet so deeply on that idea and have had a lot more problems. The United States, for all its flaws, for all its original sins, has bet very, very deeply on that idea. And I think now we're living in this moment in which that idea, not just the procedure, but the idea that we can make choices to take care of each other democratically, is under threat in a few different ways. It's under threat from authoritarian leaders, from fundamentalists, but it's also, as you say, under threat from people who seem much kinder and gentler than that, people who just want to buy art for the museum. What's wrong with those people? And the guy you describe, I don't know him, and I hope I never meet him, but the guy who is a tax evader, is living in Cyprus, is not even part of his country, but who wants to launder his reputation in Norway, wants to be seen by the kind of people who go to museums in Norway as a good guy, as a hero, and who, we must remember, is enabled in doing this by whoever in Norway is taking that money, by whichever public institutions are allowing that to be possible. And this is another very important point. This group of billionaires, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else in India or elsewhere, is only able to do this because we let them. Okay? I'll speak of Mark Zuckerberg, someone I read about in the book. Mark Zuckerberg has not only been not satisfied to spread polarization and misinformation and just make everybody waste their time. He thought it would be much better to also sabotage democracy, right? He thought it would be better for a few extra percentage points of growth to allow American democracy to be hacked by a Russian intelligence operation and have no one do anything about it. This was his choice. And this choice is only possible because for a very long time, until very recently, the press in America, and maybe you would say this about some of your billionaires here, has lionized Mark Zuckerberg, has made him a hero, a swaggering national leader, a thought leader, a person who apparently has thoughts. And under the cover, under the kind of moral glow conferred by that lionizing that we all participate in by writing about him that way in the press, by reading those things, by sort of believing them, he was able to gut punch one of the most powerful democracies on earth, one guy who just didn't want his company to be regulated or investigated, who feared maybe 5% slower growth. And we're all able to be taken in by that. So part of the effort to restore meaningful democracy that I'm calling for is not just fighting the big leaders who are in the news every day, which is important, but it is also making sure that we are resisting the petty tyranny of all these people who are sabotaging the idea of us governing ourselves for a few extra points of return on investment. And who are doing that in all the ways you say, not paying taxes, laundering their reputations. We have an opioid crisis in America that was, to a substantial degree, pushed by one family. One family. Just making money on opioids. And what did they have to do? They made billions. And what did they have to do to buy off the entire United States of America? Make several $1 million in art museum donations. That's it. That's it. And what did that mean? Until about a year or two ago, no one knew their name in connection with the opioid crisis that has killed genocide-level numbers of people in the United States. A few 100,000 people have been killed by these drugs that they have been shown, this family, to know was going to do that. But all the journalists and people like you go to literature festivals, influential people, people with platforms and the ability to get things out there, who live in cities, were visiting museums across the United States and around the world that had this family Sackler's name on the galleries. And so all the influential people in America only knew them for the arts, not the opioids. And the racket was allowed to go on. If we wake up, if we actually stand up for ourselves, there's no telling what we can achieve together. But we have to stop believing that the people most responsible for the problems of the modern world are the solution to the problems they are still causing backstage.
Well, to pick up on that, standing together, there are today several movements, and you're a journalist, and suddenly, I don't know if you feel that way, whether you're part of a movement, started a movement, or part of it. But you have, across Europe, you have here, people in the streets. And you have some, being in the movement, like whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's now the campaign for more socialist or social democratic president in America. But you also have the rise of populism both on the right and on the left, and how to make this into a functional movement. Like, in what way do you suggest that people stand together? Is it through, political campaigns? Is it through protests? Is it smaller scale, bigger scale?
There's two kinds of populism out there right now. One kind of populism, one meaning of the word, refers to whose votes you want. The other refers to who you would be fighting for if you won. Donald Trump is not a populist. He may call himself a populist, but I don't judge him by whose votes he wants. I judge him by who he's helping and who he's screwing. And Donald Trump is very clearly an oligarch working for oligarchs, funded by oligarchs, some of them American. And I'm not going to call him a populist just because he thinks he is. You have, on the other hand, real popular movements. I think you see in Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren those kind of movements, and you have others around the world, in which it's the populism of actually trying to make things work for, people, which is the actual root of the word. And what is exciting about these movements, regardless of where you are in these issues, is, to be honest, these are not anti-capitalist movements. I mean, Bernie Sanders, who's the most out there in the United States, you would say, Bernie Sanders wouldn't nationalize a single company, right? Like, we're not even really talking about the kind of socialism that was practiced in India a generation ago. We are talking about populist movements that are simply trying to restore capitalism and business and the money power and the very rich to being a group in the society among other groups that also have power and also have a say in the ruling of the country. So we need to actually dismiss the notion. Whatever Bernie Sanders calls himself, this is not socialism in any meaningful, in the sense that most people understand it. And I think one of the reasons a lot of young people are drawn to this is they're actually not caught up in 20th century psychodramas of what socialism means. They're actually just looking at the fact, which is a 2 to 10% wealth tax that would actually allow people to go to college is not really the Soviet Union. It's just common sense and fairness, right? And so, I have spent the most time in terms of the presidential race with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, interviewed both of them, Warren on stage, Bernie for a Time magazine piece. And for the Bernie piece, I spent 9 days on the road with Bernie Sanders, which is a very long amount of time to spend with someone like Bernie Sanders. I think I got 20 minutes of interviews and 2 hellos in the 9 days of traveling with him at close quarters. But I went to all these events with his campaign, his rallies. Iowa, Ohio, Nevada, Pennsylvania, all these places that in America are going to decide the election because of a very weird system we have. And I would go into these rallies, and I would see, look, we all stereotype people based on appearance, even though we're not supposed to. So I would see these people who looked like Trump voters, like 55-year-old, if you had to statistically make it up, 55-year-old white guys wearing camouflage, always a good sign in America when someone has recently one guy actually had blood on the camouflage. Like, he had shot a deer and then driven to the political rally with no time to wash his pants. Pretty good sign of a Trump voter. He may have been armed at that moment. Not unlawful in many of these places. And I would go up to them and I'd say, are you a socialist? Like, what brings you out to see Bernie Sanders? And these guys say, I'm not a socialist. I hate socialism. So, okay, but you see the guy who you're here to meet. I was like, oh, I love Bernie. I don't care he's a socialist. He's fighting for me. He's fighting for people like me. There is something happening out there where I think people are realizing that a lot of the old categories are not real. And there is a need for new thinking on some of these issues that is somewhere in between markets must be abolished and markets are the only thing that work, right? And it's interesting, when I'm in these conversations in the US, people often throw India and China at me. Maybe they don't see me. Maybe it's like a radio interview or something. And they're like, but there's India. And India just, opened it up to markets, was doing the socialism thing before, then just switched to capitalism, and now it's much better. You think, first of all, it's a little more complicated story than that. Second of all, I wrote a book about some of that period, and I have thoughts about that. And the most important thing, as you all know, is that's not what happened in India. Many things, I often say to people, around the same time India opened to markets, it began the largest affirmative action program in the history of humankind. Government action and markets, right? Which of those helps explain the story? Part of what I'm trying to advocate for is the idea of going back to a sensible understanding that we have had at many different times, that markets and capitalism and active government and an active education sector and civil society that's vigorous, all of these things working, these different humors in a society working together, none dominating the other to the point of obliteration, is the definition of a healthy society. And to suggest this is to not advocate for Venezuela.
We've decided this session to be a very democratic and inclusive session, so we will open for questions already. We passed mid-time, and then if you don't have questions, I will continue, but this is your opportunity to ask Anand the questions that, please. Yes. Do you want to point at people? Or?
No, you guys choose.
Good morning. You just mentioned how this system also destroys the planet, and you can see how exploitation of nature and of resources take place on a grand scale at the cost of people who have sort of the smallest CO2 footprint of all. However, I'm thinking in solving this problem, we will need the big companies. We will need everybody who can help out. How do you see this? How do you see this cooperation work together? For example, I'm from the Netherlands, and I think our country will be the first to flood if it continues to go like this. And you hear like, oh, we really need Shell to come up with new innovations with hydrogen power and those kind of things. And then I'm thinking, yeah, but aren't you sort of continuing the system? How can that work together?
I mean, if you're talking about how do we make sure that, companies and billionaires and innovators are part of these solutions, I'm not advocating that they shouldn't be. I'm advocating that this shouldn't be on their terms, dictated by them through these, I see this in India all the time, public-private partnerships, which people don't really understand means billionaires deciding which ones they do and which ones they don't do. Because if they don't want to fund a public-private partnership to raise a wealth tax, they're not going to fund that one, right? So we need billionaires and companies and everybody to participate on climate. I want them to participate through an old-fashioned way, which is the law, which is taxes, which is, I absolutely want ExxonMobil to be part of the solution. I don't want it to come up with the solution. I want to come up with the solution with you, and I want to send ExxonMobil the bill. What you have now is ExxonMobil having like the Green Pavilion at Davos, dictating climate solutions, taking out ads on podcasts saying, ExxonMobil, the renewable future is within reach, while continuing to be ExxonMobil. So the people who are causing these problems, I'll say again, cannot be the leaders of the search for solutions. They can be part of the solution through the law, through policy, through tax bills and regulations and compliance. But arsonists are among the least qualified firefighters.
Hello. You gave a very good idea coming from one side. I'm sure for every situation there are two sides. And what is the other side? Because billionaires don't drop from the sky. This Zuckerberg was a student and he did something that the public wanted. And that structure brought him to that place. From your statements, it appears like most of the billionaires came to this earth with billions and they don't deserve those billions. So something to that extent, that why, and another thing, if you ask somebody would you like to be poor? Would you like to be rich? I would think most sensible people will say, we would want to be rich.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I think to answer it, you have to say, why is it that there are so many Mark Zuckerbergs in the United States of America and so few in Botswana? Right? If this was just a product of human merit and intelligence, India with 1.3 billion people would have more billionaires, would have 4 times more billionaires than the United States. But it doesn't. The reality is, of course there are people with tremendous merit, just the way there are tremendous artists and tremendous writers and tremendous painters and tremendous pilots, and some people better at things than others. But this is not like an open anarchy where we just throw everybody's merit in the field and see who goes furthest. These are highly elaborate societies with particular regulatory structures, tax structures, etc., that decide how much your merit gets to rule, but more importantly, decides actually all the ways in which you are insulated from having to compete on merit. Okay? The reality is, someone like Mark Zuckerberg has it much easier in a competitive marketplace because in the industry he was in, women have simply not had the same opportunity to raise money, seed ideas, get taken seriously, and take a company to scale. So to what extent is it merit when half of humanity wasn't given the same chance he was to play? When we first started seeing problems with Facebook and democracy and elections, it was possible that we would have made choices to regulate it the way we regulate television. Television in the United States is highly regulated just around elections. Equal time rules, different things, right? It's possible we could have made that choice 10 years ago when the first murmurs, there were some people calling for that. And had we made that choice, his merit would have been the same, but his opportunity to profit as much from polarization elections would have been different. Same guy, but different. If we had made the social choice in the United States to say, if you want to be part of this country, you can't use Bermuda and the Cayman Islands or the Netherlands to avoid taxes. If you want to be part of the United States, you want to make money here, do that. His merit would have been the same, but his fortune would have been smaller. So yes, some people have more talent than others, and some people invent things that others don't, and some people will always make more money than others. No one's questioning that. But it is a social choice about how much we let merit dictate, but more importantly, how much we let mediocre people cling to wealth and power that in many cases they are not entitled to, simply because we have decided to let them cling to it. If the world was as meritocratic as you describe, the Forbes list would have a lot more dresses than suits. If the world was as meritocratic as you described, the Forbes list would be much more beautifully colorful. If the world was as meritocratic as you describe, when I sit in airplanes around the world and see who it is that's in the front flying to business meetings, it wouldn't be 90% men in so many countries on Earth, still in 2020. So we have to understand that merit has an important place in our society without being tricked by some of the richest and most powerful people in the world into confusing their mediocrity and their clinging to power and their lobbying. If any of the wealthiest people were as confident in their merit as you are in their merit, they wouldn't need to lobby. People here in front.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. So when you were writing this book, did you get any threats of any sort? Because you're writing about some of the most powerful men and women in the world, and that is one question. And if you did not get any death threats, do you think your book is really effective?
That's one of those like you're screwed either way questions. That's the literature equivalent of the "Are you still beating your wife?" question. No, I did not get, I just got not invited to a lot of things. I go to a lot of places once. And, I will say that part of what happened with this book, for which I'm very grateful, is this book landed in a moment in which this fit the intuition of a lot of people that something was wrong, maybe something they hadn't, because they're like have real jobs and are not idle writers, like maybe they hadn't spent 3 years trying to parse and think about, but something felt not right. Maybe you shop at Amazon, but you wonder, why is it that we're going to end up in a country with a single store? You still shop there, like many of us, but you wonder, is that the future we want? Or you use Uber and you feel, what's going to happen to this driver's family if the economy goes in this direction? We all have these feelings, but I got to spend some time thinking about it, and the book landed in a moment where I think a lot of people outside these circles of power certainly were feeling this way, but a lot of people in the palace, and I know here this is not a metaphor, are feeling the same way. Some of them say so openly. There are some very wealthy people who've actually started to advocate, like Abigail Disney, Eli Broad in the US, have started to advocate for higher taxes on people like them, right? Who have started to understand that the only decent way to live in an age of inequality as a rich person is to become a traitor to your class. But even the ones who are not like that, many of them still, some push back against me, argue against me. Bill Gates first blurbed my book, which suggested kind of the first reaction, and then a year later called me a communist when he was asked about it at Davos. But many of them are in between those two extremes, neither blurbing nor calling me a communist, knowing there's something wrong. And so, no, there haven't been that many threats. There's been a lot of disinvitations, a lot of, taking like a wide berth away while crossing me at a party. Should this book have resulted in more personal danger? Probably, but I'll try again next time, I'm writing about maybe pluralism next, so I think I have a better shot.
So, I wanted to ask you, what makes you think
I'm gonna make sure we get some good gender balance in these questions.
What makes you think that the billionaires or the elites wouldn't just make their way back to the top? Because India still is, by its preamble, a socialist republic, and we have progressive taxation, but only for the middle class. The billionaires, like it or not, do control the result of the elections in our country.
Correct. And, I think if I'm not wrong, in this country, the issue is not just the tax rates, but the fact that whatever those rates are, a lot of people don't pay them, right? And that's to some extent a problem everywhere. It's probably more of a problem here than in some places. But it's worth remembering, the nice thing about there being 200 countries in the world is these are all solvable problems. They're not easy, but a lot of other countries used to have this problem, and they figured out a way to do tax compliance. There is some level of penalty, some level of enforcement, some percentage of your friends who are now in prison because of tax evasion. There's some level of that at which people start paying their taxes. We just know this from other countries. It's a hard problem, but it's not an insoluble problem. And I think, I'll tell you an interesting anthropological thing. When I go on Facebook, which I don't very often, but occasionally, when I'm saying something about Zuckerberg, I usually post it on Facebook. Actually, that's the only time. And whenever I've done that in recent years, all these people around the world like what I like, except generally in India. And all these people in India are reacting like, come on, we want to all be Zuckerberg. I want to be Zuckerberg. You want to be Zuckerberg. I actually don't want to be Zuckerberg. I would love to not destroy democracy, personally. And I think we have to remember that it is completely within our grasp to set a different slate of rules that would keep people in check and to actually work among other countries. I mean, all these very rich people love to send their kids abroad to the United States, right? So get the United States' help to say, you know what, you actually can't send your kids to the University of the United States if you are not paying taxes, if you're using all these shady trusts. You'll get these people's attention very quickly. There are ways to solve these problems, but people have to want to solve them. And as the prior question indicates, this begins with actually withdrawing from these people the adulation that we have been lending them, that is actually their biggest source of immunity and impunity. If you take that away, that cultural idea, this is the whole premise of my book and what I'm trying to argue. I think these people are protected above all by what we believe about them. And if we change what we believe about them, all these policies become possible.
So you've been directing your fire at people like Zuckerberg and the billionaires, which rightfully so. But to some extent, aren't we all complicit? Because, you know, many, many millions of people in the US, they participate in either pension plans or 401k, which are all invested into these big companies. So how do you, in that sense, we're all complicit, right? Because we want those returns and so on. So how do you convince people? I've heard so many people that say that they're voting for Trump because of their 401k. So how do you convince these people that there's an alternate model that will benefit them even more?
Yeah, I don't really understand people who want to enjoy their retirement savings in a authoritarian country, but good for them. Must be nice to live with all their privileges and immunities. Look, there's a truth in the idea that we're all complicit through the way we shop. I mean, all of us got here burning carbon today one way or another. We're complicit through our investment, yes. But I sort of want to push back against this we're all complicit notion, which I think actually has become a billionaire talking point that a lot of us have gotten seduced by. Sure, we're all complicit. But the complicity of the Amazon shopper is not the same as the complicity of the Amazon owner. And the complicity of ExxonMobil is not the same as the complicity of the person who fills their car with gas because the only job they could find is an hour away. And the complicity of people who use Uber and feel slightly bad about the lack of labor protections is not the same as the venture capital firms that invest in companies specifically with the purpose, and the stated purpose in some cases, of blowing up unionized employment and trying to move things to a kind of informal sector. So, sure, we're all complicit. We all breathe the air. But these are specific economic and social crimes that are being committed by specific people in specific ways, in specific times and places. Lobbying, fighting for these tax policies, fighting against climate regulation. And it is a weird kind of self-hatred in a way to think that you are as bad as the oil companies because you change your light bulbs too often. We're not going to light bulb our way out of climate change. Your better behavior is not going to solve some of these problems. It's part of it. But the real problem here is a relatively small number of people running the planet as a casino in which they always win. And I think if we take our eyes off the ball of that and get consumed by guilt about these things, we're letting people get away with it.
Even though I opened for a democratic discussion, the clock is the dictator of this session, and I have to wrap up, but I want to talk a bit about the future and try to also kind of go into some of the questions you asked, like about where do you go from now, about the threats, whether you got that. Do you feel that any, I mean, as you said, Bill Gates, he endorsed the book in the beginning. Do you feel any of those billionaires feel threatened by you? Have you changed any of them? I mean, you do change us all through your stories, through giving us a way both of seeing these things, but also giving us a language to express it. And you have 500,000 followers on Twitter that you try to change every morning. But have you changed any of, you say you're being disinvited from events, but are you getting up there to change any of those who are ExxonMobil or Amazon or that kind of people? So if you can say something about that, but also just like where do you take it from here? Are you still a journalist? Are you a writer? Are you leader of a movement? You have the final say.
I think I have seen 3 levels of change with this book, and I think this applies to many books. And before that, I'll just say, I see Willie in the front. Thank you to the people who make this festival, because books still have a tremendous amount of power. There's maybe no other event in the world that actually looks and feels as democratic as this one in celebrating the printed word and reminding us that the printed word is actually for everybody and can change the world for everybody and not for a few. And what I've seen with my book is some people within the palace reading this book or reading other books or just being part of the winds of the age and changing their mind about some things, realizing that they want to live on the right side of history, which is always the most powerful motivator. Most people don't want to be hated by their grandchildren, so helping people see that is always very powerful. The second layer of change I've seen with this book is I think this book got a lot of journalists who themselves have all these big platforms to maybe cover things 1 or 2 degrees differently. When Jeff Bezos announces he's giving money away or is going to save Indian retail, there's one kind of story you could write that's credulous, and there's another kind of story you could write about how all the other people who promised that weren't telling the truth, and he didn't pay his taxes on this and that. And I think I've seen journalists turn a little bit towards that more skeptical coverage of these plutocrats. But finally, the biggest level of change I've seen that gives me so much hope for books is books can shift the available language to people in the political arena defined broadly, civil society, political movements, resistance movements. Books can make some kinds of existing language reveal some language to be ridiculous, fraudulent. And books can also take language that maybe we don't use enough, that we ought to use more, and elevate it and give it a chance and make us hear some other people we're not hearing. And so I come away from this, heading into a new book, more confident than ever in the power of books to change how people think. And I thank you all for coming out and listening and for celebrating the power of books.
Anand Giridharadas, winner take all. He will be signing books.
Yeah.
Please read it at the bookstore.
Where's the signing? The signing is right there with the sign that says author signing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
We wish to thank Anand Giridharadas, Asne Seirstad, and the Business Standard for this very enlightening and gripping session. Do note that the authors will be signing their books at the book signing desk located right at the entrance of Charbagh. The next session at Charbagh is session 57, The Black Dwarfs of the Good Little Bay, and it'll begin shortly.
He's making his investments talk. Business Standard.